Thank you, Brother Darren, and good morning, everyone. The story of David and Goliath is probably one of the best known in the Bible. It's a perfect Sunday school lesson with a villain and a hero who triumphs against all the odds. It also lends itself to reenactment in Sunday school end-of-year shows, and we've probably seen it with the largest member of our ecclesia we can find all dressed up as Goliath, and some little Sunday school scholar slaying him and gleefully chopping his head off. Some time ago I read a short article by Fateh Batoy of the Huddersfield Ecclesia in the Christadelphian magazine sometime last year, and it started me looking again at this story. And I'd like to enlarge our view of this story, as it's much more than just a remarkable story. The story takes place in the Valley of Elah, as we had. Sorry for the long reading, Pete. It was lovely and gives us the full background to what we're going to talk about. The place is Ephes Dammim, which means the field or the border of blood, and that's what it ended up being, of course. It's on the boundary between the country of Israel and Philistia. But this is by no means the first battle between these two nations. About 40 years earlier, at the time of Eli the high priest, there was a battle at Aphek. Aphek's about 50 kilometres north of where the Goliath battle occurred. In 1 Samuel 4 and 5, this story is told us. On this battle, in the first day, the Philistines were victorious and 4,000 of Israel died. To combat this, the Philistines decided they'd send to Hophni and Phinehas, two of the sons of the high priest, and those two brought the Ark of the Covenant up to the battle, and you remember probably the story. They went into battle again, this time with God's Ark with them, sure that they would succeed. It was not to be. Israel was again defeated, and this time 30,000 died, including Hophni and Phinehas. And what's more, the Ark of the Covenant was captured and taken to the Philistine temple of their fish god, Dagon. It was a trophy placed before the feet of the idol. The next day, the idol of Dagon was found face down in the temple. The Philistines weren't sure about this, so they set it up firmly again. The next morning when they walked in, it was face down again, this time with its head broken off. And at the same time, the town of Ashdod, where the idol was struck with a plague. For 7 months, the Philistines moved the ark round amongst their main towns, and each town was struck with a plague. And finally, convinced that the power of their God was nothing to the power of the nation of Israel's God, the ark was returned to Israel by the Philistines. Of course, Hophni and Phinehas were foolish in thinking that bringing an object, even an object as important, as special as the Ark of the Covenant, was going to somehow magically mean they would win all their battles. The formalities of our religious worship, the place where we worship or the way we do it, they're not the things that relate us to God, and they're not the things that give us victory. It's something much more spiritual than that. Now, we come back to the Valley of Elah and the nations gathered there with Goliath and Saul. And for the men there, I'm sure this earlier battle would have come to mind. They would have heard about it. Very few of them would have probably been involved, but they would have heard about it from their parents. The Israelites would have remembered two staggering defeats and the losses that they made. The Philistines would remember being victors, but also probably remember the strange stories of deadly plagues that seemed to follow them for 7 months while that ark was in Philistia. So now, in Elah, in that valley, with the nations on opposite sides, the Israelites on the east on hill country and the Philistines on the west, we have a giant and a stalemate between them for 40 days, over a month. Neither army was prepared to leave their secure mountain positions and go down into the valley. Just the giant man called Goliath. It's thought that Goliath was about 2.8 metres tall, maybe close to 9 feet. That's pretty tall. His chainmail alone weighed 57 kilograms, and his spearhead, let alone the beam, which we're told was like a shaft, his spearhead was 7 kilograms. In fact, at Giza, which is in the northern areas of the Philistine territory, archaeologists have uncovered skeletons in graves, which are giant skeletons that pretty much match this. So there were, at that time, a group of extraordinarily large gentlemen, the giants of Anak. Goliath was covered in bronze plates. We read it today. Armour, a bit like the scales of his fish god, I think. In contrast, the Israelites were small, had very little armour. Saul was probably the only one that had a suit of proper armour anyway, and seemed to be almost impossible to face up to Goliath. Even the tallest, Saul, who was head and shoulders above most of the people of the nation, and David were far shorter than Goliath. I think it's a mistake to imagine David was small. He was not childlike. He may have been a youth, but he was certainly not small. After all, he did try on Saul's armour, and it would be not worth even trying it on if he wasn't about the same size as Saul. And David's objection to the armour was not that it was too big for him, but that he was not used to it, as we heard. So for 40 days, Goliath had challenged Israel every morning and every night, saying, as we read in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 10, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And that was the challenge that in verse 10 rang out twice a day. More importantly, as David realised as soon as he arrived there, in verse 26 of 1 Samuel, who is this Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? It wasn't just the armies of Israel, it was the armies of the living God. And 5 times in this chapter we read the challenge and the taunt of Goliath is mentioned. This challenge was much more than a challenge to the nation. It was a challenge to Israel's God. It's no accident, I think, that Goliath spoke each morning and evening, just at the time when the Israelites would know that the morning and evening sacrifices would have been made for them back in the tabernacle. To Goliath and to the Philistines, this was about more than who was the best nation. It was who was the best God. And then after 40 days, something changed. David arrives. And suddenly now, instead of 2 armies and 1 giant, Goliath, there are 2 giants on the field. One is a giant Philistine from Gath, a man of enormous strength. And one is a giant Israelite from Bethlehem. This man, David, a giant of faith. His attitude is not that he could destroy Goliath, but that God could and would destroy Goliath. It's a totally different perspective, and the whole scene changes. In 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 45, we read, David said to the Philistines, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And in verse 45, he encapsulates what's really the battle. It's the battle between Dagon and the God of Israel. It wasn't a David versus Goliath thing at all. And this kind of battle, a Dagon versus the God of Israel battle, is an easy battle to win. He knew that the Lord would be his shepherd. And so we read that David went down to the brook, trusting in God, and selected 5 smooth stones, and then ran up towards the army and Goliath. He was eager and totally confident. And the outcome we know. There must have been hundreds of men with slings in the army of Israel. The tribe of Benjamin were famous for their slings and how good they were with them. But there was only one that had the faith to put it to use for God. And David's sling sent a smooth stone that hit Goliath in the temple, and he fell down dead, and God triumphed. If we look in Judges and Samuel, in the books of Judges and Samuel, there are many mentions of giants. Caleb and the other spy with him were not afraid of them, and Caleb even asked for and was granted Kiriath Arba as his portion of the promised land when the land was divided up. And Arba was the father of the giants, and the land that he picked was the heartland of the giants. Caleb's land was giant territory and he knew it. Yet that's the country he asked God for. Caleb and Joshua, the only 2 spies who weren't frightened by the giants. The other 10 spies said, "We are not able to go up." Just as we read in verse 33 of this story that Saul said to David, "You are not able to go up," because Saul was frightened of the giants too. Only 2 out of those 10 spies understood that the battle for the land of Israel was God's battle when the nation entered Canaan. They had nothing to fear if God was with them. Joshua chapter 15 tells us that Caleb drove out 3 sons of Anak in battle. Here in this valley of Elah, David understood that this battle with Goliath was God's battle. So David, in faith, had no fear. And that, of course, is a lesson for us, isn't it? These giants troubled Israel. We also come across giants in our lives, problems which seem at first to be insurmountable. They can be all kinds of things that almost overwhelm us, things that bring feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, of loneliness, depression and rejection. These giants we struggle with, and we struggle hard sometimes to overcome them. The wonderful lesson of this battle in the Valley of Elah is that we alone cannot overcome these our giants, but with prayer and with our God, we can. We can get past these tough times. We can slay our giants with faith in God. Just like those giants of faith that are in this story. Sometimes when we read the story, we see the physical giants, the men who were opposing God, and we don't really stop and see the giants of faith. They're not so obvious. We have to pick them out carefully. But there were plenty of them there. There was David and Caleb and Samuel and Joshua. And if we only look carefully in Scripture, we will find many, many examples of giants of faith to encourage and inspire us in our struggles in our life. While we're speaking of faith, I wonder why David picked up 5 smooth stones from the brook. Why 5? Did he not have faith that God would be with him when he used his sling for the first stone? Did he want 4 spares? I'm not sure of the answer to this. I've heard a number of possible suggestions. The best, I think, comes from a verse in 2 Samuel 21 where we hear of the battles where David's mighty men killed 4 brothers of Goliath. And it's just possible, I think, that David was showing that he knew that life is not just one battle that we fight and then it's over and done with and it's all solved, but many ongoing ones in our service to God. And David was prepared to keep fighting those battles, just as we must keep fighting our spiritual battles with God's help. It's interesting after this battle to see King Saul's reactions at the end of that chapter that Peter read in verse 55. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistines, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" Now, why did Saul ask that? He knew David. I mean, that very day he'd tried his armour on with him and talked about it. A year or so earlier, David had been the musician in the court, helping Saul cope with his depression. David was well known to Saul. Why pretend he didn't know him? I don't know why it is. One promise is that Saul had promised whoever slew Goliath would have his entire family given lifetime tax exemption. That sounds pretty good, as well as money and the daughter of the king. So perhaps he just wanted to know the family and which family he had to give the tax exemption to. This seems to me a bit unlikely. It's very sad, but a much more likely explanation is that Saul was becoming very jealous of David and he'd begun to consider killing him. So he's beginning to get information to that end and set up his leader of his army to start thinking that way. Isn't it a sad comparison between a faithful David and a king who lacked faith and confidence in himself or in his God? Let us turn briefly to look now at what happened when Goliath was slain. We read on verse 49, Goliath fell on his face to the earth, just like that idol of his god Dagon had done some 10 years or so before in the temple in Ashdod. Then we read that David draws Goliath's sword out of its sheath. Notice Goliath had not even had time to get his sword out in this battle. And David cuts off Goliath's head, just like the idol of Dagon lost its head back in Ashdod. And the message is clear, isn't it? Israel's God is far superior to this idol. But not only did David cut off Goliath's head, but he also read in verse 54, David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. He put his army in his tent. Why on earth would he take the head of Goliath to Jerusalem? Remember, at this time Jerusalem was a Jebusite city. It wasn't captured by the Israelites. David wouldn't have even been allowed to enter. The Jebusites prided themselves on having an enormous fortified city that no one could get into, not even the lame. And the Jebusites certainly wouldn't want this trophy of a Philistine defeat in their city to make them a target of the Philistines, who were also their enemies. They would want nothing to do with it. The only possible explanation that seems reasonable to me is David took this giant's head as he cut it off, either to display it to them to show the power of the God of Israel, or perhaps just to bury it outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And it seems to me highly likely that this site outside the city became known as the place of the skull, or as we say in the New Testament, Golgotha. It seems to me entirely appropriate that the very spot where the giant who challenged Israel and their God was buried should also be the very place where the greatest of all giants of faith, the Lord Jesus Christ, would offer his life as a sacrifice and deal the final death blow to the head of the serpent's sin, as in Genesis 3. The place where Jesus, through God's grace, achieved for us the greatest of all victories, the victory that offers us freedom from sin and death, and the victory that offers all those who want to come to him the same. This amazing story tells us so much, doesn't it? In so many layers. The first layer is that simple story of the triumph of right over wrong. The second, that triumph in God depends on faith in him. The third layer is that there's a way that we can cope with our lives, giants, if we hope through God and have faith in him. And the fourth and ultimate layer is that wonderful one that we so often find in Old and New Testaments. The story tells us of a way of salvation through Christ's sacrifice that we come here to remember today.